Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This video is going to be another deck building video. It's been a while since we've done one of these. This time it's going to be on how I made 3 meta decks in this expansion alone. These decks are Shockspitter Hunter, Evolved Shaman and Deathrattle Rogue. So actually I made all 3 of these decks within the first week of the expansion. Now the theme is that all 3 decks have deck building constraints on them, and the constraints help us find a list a lot quicker because there's only certain things you're allowed to do, and that's what we're going to explore in this video, going through each deck list one by one. Okay, first up we have the Shockspitter Hunter. This is obviously being recorded after it's been nerfed twice, so I have to imagine this card's 2 mana for now. So this is the list that I arrived on in the first week of the expansion. At the time, Shockspitter was obviously just seeing a lot of experimentation and a lot of play, but most builds were not running the Hydrolodon Ram build or with the Wild Spirits and stuff. They were running like loads of bounce effects and basically just trying to cheese your opponent with face damage without caring about the board at all. And those versions were quite a bit worse than this one because they had one game plan and one game plan only. They didn't really deal with board much or have much board control of themselves, and they were very reliant on drawing the early weapons, and if they didn't, the deck mega sucked. So this build's not like completely 100% optimized, but that can't really be expected within a week, but the bulk of the deck is close to it. And I was going to talk through how I arrived on those conclusions. Okay, so there's going to be some obvious inclusions in the deck for it to even function, and you don't really do any playtesting or too much thinking to figure out these ones. The Candle Shot, Shockspitter, pretend this is 2 mana. And then the combo involves that Devouring Swarm, Breeders, Bran. And this is like the baseline, what you need. Okay, so we have the baseline. Now we need to just consider what we do with the rest of the 21 cards in this deck. A good thing to do if you're playing any sort of deck is look at previous decks and what packages have worked well in the past. And Hunter, the premier package for them, and has been for the past couple of expansions, is the Wild Seeds package. Wild Spirits, Spirit Poacher tend to have like the highest mulligan win rate in like almost all decks that they're played in, and I don't see why this one will be particularly different, particularly when one of the Wild Seeds give you a weapon which works nicely for the Shockspitter. I also put in a Rallen at the time. It was a Renathal meta, so going a little slower was absolutely fine, and it is a lot of value. Nowadays it is probably a bit too slow for the deck. Okay, so we got these cards. Then we're looking back to our original combo. We might want more weapons for the Shockspitter to get the value. So we can look at weapon, and the really 2 options are Bloodseeker and Harpoon Gun. Some decks run both nowadays just for more face damage, but at the time I felt like 6 weapons may be too much and I wanted to play more for a board style deck. And the choice between the 2, Harpoon Gun actually, it seems like the better card in general. People play Beast on it for a while, know it's very strong. And obviously you can discount the Shockspitter, but the curve is actually worse than the Bloodseeker. The Bloodseeker is a little bit easier to fit in onto your turns because it's cheaper, which is a big deal, and especially you get to start swinging with it earlier, which is a big deal for the Wild Spirits. Oftentimes if you Wild Spirits get the Stag and then you Harpoon Gun, well, one of your charges of the Harpoon Gun gets overwritten, so I felt the Bloodseeker was a bit better. Okay, if we go back to our original cards, we have the Selective Breeder. Now this is mainly used for finding the Shockspitters and getting extra Shockspitters, but we have the benefit of 2 extra beasts that we're allowed to run in the deck, and still guarantee get a Shockspitter every single time from this if we need it. I basically just look through and see if there's any 2 beasts that work particularly well together or individually strong enough that you might want to actually pick them off the breeder sometimes. None of these seem good enough. None of these really seem good enough. This has been a strong beast in the past, but not in this deck because you don't really want Sunken Saber pulling out the Shockspitter. This one's pretty good individually, as is this one. But what really spoke to me looking at these ones is the synergy between Hydrolodon and the Ram. The fact that if you Ram on 4, you can Hydro on 5, which is very strong into a lot of decks. And it doesn't really cost much to put these in the deck because it's a 3-card package that just boosts Selective Breeder quite a bit. And just gives you an alternate win con. You don't have to always go for the Shockspitter, you can just win through board quite easily. And with the Wild Seed pack, it's very reasonable you're going to be okay on board. Additionally, the Ram has good synergy with the Shockspitter itself. Just discounting that allows you to do more combo turns with the Bran or the Devouring Swarm. So it looked all very nice, all very neat. Okay, so we need 11 more cards in the deck. Individual strong card, Tavish, in you go. Now, we are a semi-combo deck, and there are some new cards introduced in the March of the Lich King. And whenever I'm doing deck building, I always just like trying new stuff. Just because you don't know if it's strong until you try it, really. So my initial builds, I was just like, looking at the Arcane package that they introduced this set. I just had my thoughts on what ones are strong. This card I put in the deck too. And we wanted card draw. The Conjuring Arrow seemed pretty nice. And I thought Arcane Quiver to find the Conjuring Arrow. We can try that out and just have all the card draw we need. Also, since we're a combo deck, tracking seems like a naturally good inclusion in the deck to try and find our key cards. And now we're at 28 out of 30. We do have the required amount for Barak, and like I said, we're a combo deck, so the card draw does seem like it would be good. And I'm looking at this and I'm looking pretty happy. And we're just trying to, at this stage, find any weaknesses within the deck. The game plan basically looks like we've got early Wild Spirits going into the draw, going into the Shockspitter combo. So is there any weaknesses in this curve? And like the main one that struck out to me is that there's not really any 1-mana plays, and we're a board deck. Candleshot obviously very nuts, you're very happy if you get that, but you're not going to get that every time. So I thought probably just needs a 1-drop in the deck to help contest other board decks. And the options for 1-drops, Batty Guest is the best of the Hunter ones, or there's Trog in neutral, and they're really the two options. And I think the Batty Guest was slightly better. Nowadays people tend to run both, which is fine as well. Depends on the metagame you're in. Like this one's just a build that was initially very, very greedy. Obviously we're at 31 cards here, so we need to cut something. At the time I just cut one of these. Whenever it comes to making decks, you do have to playtest a bit, so some cards ended up not making the cut eventually. Nowadays builds tended to be a lot faster, but that was also a symptom of how fast the metagame was against it. The Rogues and Demon Hunter decks really required you to go quickly. So cards like Barack Obama, I just called it Barack Obama there, Barack Oralon tended to get cut, and people started playing Trogs for early game and Harpoon Guns for extra weapon attacks, and more going all in on the Shockspitter. However, the metagame we're in now is a bit more board centric, so cutting the Keen Eye spot is probably not a good idea anymore. You probably want to run this card. It's very good against other board decks. Also, people found the Quiver not to be great and the Conjured Arrow unnecessary in the faster metagame, so these cards ended up being cut. However, if you're in a much slower metagame, they are quite good just for finding your combo. Two of these probably not optimal anyway, because there is a bit of a downside with Arcane Quiver. If you run two of them, you can discover the second Arcane Quiver, and it's a bit awkward. You really want to find the Conjured Arrow, and just taking one spell out of the pool that it can discover actually boosts that quite a bit. So a build like this is completely reasonable in today's metagame, I would say. You could argue you don't need these. Go for Trog. You can go mega board centric, cut the Conjured Arrow stuff, and not go so much for card draw, and then play Doggy Biscuit. That's also fine. There's definitely different routes you can take, but the bulk of the deck was discovered earlier, and I just sort of wanted to take you through the thought process of how I arrived to that conclusion. Okay, now we have the Evolved Shaman, and this set deck is the build we see today, and we're going to take you through the process of getting to this bit. And again, like the Hunter, there are constraints in the deck, and like the Hunter, there's a baseline good cards thing that we start with. There's constraints that we need in the deck, and that just allows us to formulate the rest of the deck quite nicely. So how do we end up from nothing to this? Well, we have to think about what are the best things in Shaman. What's the OP stuff? What happens against Shaman that you're annoyed about? And the answer, the strongest card in Shaman, really, is this bad boy, the Gold Shah Null. Evolving the Null is very, very, very strong, and we're going to basically try to abuse this as much as we can. To do that, already been discovered from before. This obviously very, very strong. Plus we have the evolve effects for it. And we have the Convincing Disguise. Convincing Disguise works very nicely with the tiny toys. So we have this kind of basic package of evolved synergy cards, let's say. Now, there was a new card released in the set, which has synergy with Null, makes your hand size big, which is Prescience. And it tutors the Null as well. So this is what I was very excited going into expansion about for Shaman. The Prescience seemed like a very, very strong card. I wasn't actually accurate with how strong it actually is. It is way better than I thought it would be. And the reason, just like tutoring your Null and pretty much always having Null on 10-5, nice and cheap, is just mega strong. So when it comes to Prescience, obviously the constraint is you want minions in your deck that cost 5 or more. The Null's obviously one of them, but we can't just only run the Nulls. It's going to make this card brick too often. So we need to look at other cards to put in the deck. Glug seems like a good one. Another thing you don't want to be doing is like putting loads of big minions in the deck. Like this thing. All these things. You might think, oh yeah, we'll just fill our deck with loads of big, generically good minions, you know. The problem with doing this, it means that your Prescience is not going to actually draw the Null, which is the one that you want the most. So there's two forces acting here. One, we need enough minions in the deck so that Prescience doesn't brick, but we don't want too many minions so that Prescience doesn't draw the Null. So how many minions should that be? Around 5 seems like a good amount. That way you can draw 1 minion and play 2 Presciences and still get the max draw, which is, on average, you're going to draw a minion before Prescience. You're not going to have double Prescience every game, and that amount seems fine. I've tried through playtesting running only 3 minions, and 3 seem too few. The Prescience just brick too often, or if you draw 2 Prescience, you've just got a completely dead card in your hand, which is a very big deal. And 4 seemed almost okay, but again, you brick the Prescience a bit too much. So 5 seemed like the optimal amount. Okay, so we've come to the conclusion we'd probably want 5 minions in the deck. So that means the rest of the deck needs to be filled with spells, and luckily Shaman has a lot of board presence spells. And we're just going to go through all of those and just fill up that. Cavern, obviously a very good one. Command and Epsilon make a lot of sense. Individually good card, Brucan, in you go. I tried this spell out in the deck because we are a spread wide deck, and I found it to be a little too situational and a bit too much mana. You need to make a board and play this afterwards, and then you can't evolve your boards afterwards to get the value out of it, so I found it a bit too bad. This is a board in a can card, but since we're running Prescience and Wildpaw Cavern, the overload from it is a bit too harmful, so I decided not to play this one. So we're filling the deck with spell candidates, and we've got to keep in mind we want to be making our nulls as best as possible. And to do that, you need to keep your hand size big, so you don't actually want to spend cards in the early game that decrease your hand size if you can do other stuff. So Things like this, which not super powerful anyway, probably don't make the cut. This is okay, but again, it has the constraint that it makes the nulls worse. Plus, there's not too many free health minions that you can get the value out of it. But I will say this is like a fine card to run in the deck. Chisel is a very good card in the deck. Just gives you a lot of tokeny boys, allows you to keep making boards for your Primordial Wave and your Convincing Disguise. And it provides ways to infuse this Convincing Disguise, which is very, very strong. This doesn't make sense, the overload. It's not that good. Wind Chill makes a lot of sense in the deck. It's just a cycle card to find your powerful plays, and it doesn't decrease your hand size, and it's very cheap. So, pretty nice to run that. Toyed with the idea of the Geyser, particularly with a Shaman Scroll. A Shaman Scroll doesn't decrease your hand size, and you can Geyser to get the other scroll and fill up your hand size with that. But I found that just to be a bit too slow. While not completely awful, I felt a bit unnecessary, particularly because there's enough ways to fill up your hand size for Null with the Prescient and the Schooling. This card's okay to draw the Command of Neptulon. I used to run this as a filler card before this expansion, but probably not strong enough nowadays. And then we put Farsight in the deck, and the reason Farsight is in the deck, it might seem like a weak card, but it does something very nice, which is it spends tempo, enabling like a future play by discounting something big, but it doesn't decrease your hand size. So when you're going for the null, like you sometimes just don't want to spend cards, because then it enables your null plus muck balls on the next turn, so you just end up toteming. And on those turns, it's just better to do a Farsight instead. It's a bit more tempo. It's one of the cards that is a lot better going first than going second, because there's not really many turn 3 plays, and this is one of the better ones. And obviously we put in the Bloodlust as just a finisher, because we are just a token deck. And that is the 28 spells we run in the deck. So when it comes to finding the last 2 minions, I just had to look through the collection and playtest some stuff. Potential candidates. This one seems okay because it spreads wide. We're like a spread widey deck. If we keep spreading wide, that's good. But often I found you just didn't have the board space, particularly with all the totems that you summon through the chisel. And it often came online a little bit too late. If you prescience it, that's already one shadow. You can get more from like Wind Chill potentially. But Wind Chill or Command and Epsilon add to it as well. But I found like by the time it was ready, like an acceptable play you wanted to do, it was already like turn 7 or 8 when you've got things like Glog you'd rather do or Tiny Toys instead. So this just ended up being stuck in my hand. I tried this card as well just because it was new. Seemed like a reasonable stat line. It's fine, but it's just a bit too slow. Rogil is actually pretty decent, but I eventually cut it because it has anti-synergy with the evolve effects, and if you've got a bunch of totems, you can't actually trade off the totems, and your opponent's probably not incentivized to do so. Plus, it doesn't actually protect you from AoEs, but he's pretty decent, particularly with Schooling in the deck, so not a terrible option. Lots and lots of card draw of this thing, but it's just a bit too slow. The Prescience summons 2 minions, so it's almost infused straight away, but it's not actually infused straight away, which is a problem, because you have to do another play after the Prescience, and then this is active afterwards. It's ultimately just way too slow. You'd think Queen of Shard would work in this deck because we run so many spells, and actually Vicious Syndicate suggested this card as well in one of their early reports, but it doesn't work for a few reasons. Number one, if you play the Prescience, you need to play 3 more spells afterwards before playing the Queen of Shara, which is kind of difficult to infuse, and then you have to play it, and then you get something for the next turn, like the Colossal for the next turn. That's just way too slow. It's much better to play something more impactful that you get immediately from the Prescience, in my opinion. Plus, like, even if you're going that curve, this deck actually has pretty great late game plays anyway. You have the Tiny Toys evolve, you have the Glug, you have the Brucan. So adding this to the deck just gets in the way of those other plays. So it's just really not necessary. We really want just something to bridge the gap for turn 5 before we get to those other stuff. The 6-drop slot, this seemed okay as a finisher because you evolve your nulls. They're big scary minions. You can win through them to kill, but I found it to just be a bit too situational to be worth it. Particularly when Bloodlust is just an absolutely fine finisher. Master Reveler is a reasonable inclusion, particularly if you put in Neptulon, run a 6 minion card. Particularly if you run Neptulon, you run 6 minions. The Master Reveler, if it pulls out Glug or the Neptulon, is pretty strong. It's slightly awkward. You prescience on 4, and then you command on Neptulon on 5. You can't play a 6 mana thing on 6, which is a big deal, because that's kind of the curve you want to be doing on a lot of games. And also, the prescience might just draw out your colossal minions, and then you just got Master Revelers that don't actually do anything. Sylvanas also okay in the deck because you run a lot of tokeny things to infuse it, but ultimately not strong enough, I think. Not too much else on these mana costs, so we go up to the top end, and we're looking basically for mana cheating. And there's 2 options. There's Naga Giant, which is actually not too bad because we run a lot of spells in the deck. But I found it came online just slightly a little bit too late for it to be good. Like, you kind of have to have already done the Tiny Toys evolve play before you actually get to play the Giant, which is a little bit too late in my opinion. And then I just settled on the Sea Giants because we're a very tokeny deck, so it's kind of easy to get these sort of cheap onto the board, particularly if your opponent's playing a board deck themselves. And it seemed like an okay filler slot. And this is the list that I posted for the first week, and it's the one that's still the most popular one on HS Replay, and it's fine, but it's not the best. There is a better option. That took me another week to find, maybe. And that one I got there from the Master Reveler synergy. So the Master Reveler, let's just take out a Farsight for now and put the Neptulon in. So the Master Reveler stuff I tried in a different... I tried before the set, before we got Prescience. And it worked kind of well. Master Reveler hits the Glug, very good. If it hits the Neptulon, very good. Get a lot of board in a can. But the problem with this was, like I said before, the Prescience can draw the thingies and you just got Revelers that don't do anything. But since I kept drawing the Colossals, I was like, what if we sub these out for something that can just cheat out the Colossals from your hand? Which is Vol'jin. So with some of the other minions, like Rockgill, for instance, or this thing, or the Sea Giant, you'd play Prescience, and if you didn't get a null, you were very sad because you just have a weak play in hand almost always. But with this orientation, it's nearly impossible to have a bad outcome, because when you Prescience, you either get a null and you're happy you can do something with the null, or you quite often will get Vol'jin plus a Colossal, which is a very, very strong play, particularly the Neptulon. So yeah, this is the list. There's some like minor techs you can do. The main one really being Frostbite. You could maybe run instead of Command and Neptulon. I like the commands, but they're definitely one of the weaker cards in the deck because the overload's so awkward. You kind of really have to play it on turn 5. Playing on turn 6 just ruins the Tiny Toys or the Glug. But definitely one of the weaker cards. You could run this instead. But yeah, there's the list, and we could just see like all these constraints just led us in a direction and ended up with a very synergistic list where everything kind of works together. Stuff to make boards, stuff to keep your hand size big, stuff to chew the nulls, and stuff to evolve the nulls. And it's a very good deck right now. This is the only one that hasn't been nerfed yet. Yeah. Okay, the final deck is maybe the most spicy of the three, and this Invincible Neptulon Deathrattle Rogue. Now this deck was very strong, maybe even the strongest rogue that was available before Sinstone Graveyard and Sketchy Information got nerfed. Now at the time people were playing the Smokescreen Deathrattle Rogue with the ghouls and stuff. And that one had a few weaknesses, that it didn't really have any burst potential, and it didn't really have much removal either. It just made a load of sticky boards. But But this one was much better in that it made the sticky boards, but it also had just a lot of removal of the Colossals and a lot of burst damage, because you can just kill off your Invincibles and buff your board up a lot. And this was maybe even the best deck in the game at the time, for its brief stints before it got mega nerfed. So how did I make this deck is the big question. Now maybe you notice a theme with the Shaman, like there's very similar stuff. We've got the Master Reveler Colossal synergy, which also kind of took from the Shaman. We talked a little bit about that. But how do we arrive at that? Well, we needed a baseline, and like all great artists, you steal a little bit, and I did with this deck. I didn't come up with everything. I saw a post on competitive Hearthstone subreddit of some guy who tried this build, but he had some unoptimizations, and I basically took this deck and made it better. So his idea basically was the sketchy information would draw the Illusionist and activate it, and that would give you a cheap Master Reveler or a cheap Invincible. You play the Master Reveler, it dies, pops out Invincibles, and now you just make a really, really sticky board, particularly if you've played the Snowfall Graveyard. You play the Lieutenant, and then you get 2 Revelers, trade everything off, yada, 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 and overwhelm your opponent through just insane amounts of stats. And it was a cool idea. It looked really cool. But he said there were some problems with the deck. He said it was a bit of a meme deck, and I identified some issues with it. So I looked at this list, and I found some optimizations. So what are the optimizations that I added to this deck? Well, the first one, we just basically put in the Colossals. Just recognizing that Master Reveler putting out Colossal is very strong. And Rogue has access to a good Colossal in Krabatar, and there's a very good neutral one in Neptulon. So a Master Reveler pulling out these things, it's just a lot of board control, and just completely decimates the opponent's board if this happens. And it has the benefit that if you draw the Invincible, you still have ways to win the game. So that was the first optimization that I made. And then the second one was to cut the Forsaken Lieutenant, because when you've got all these juicy big minions, you don't want your Master Reveler to be pulling out a 2/2 of stealth. Even though this have some applications, because playing this and a Master Reveler or an Invincible on the same turn is kind of nice. Ultimately, I think it's not worth it or necessary for the deck to function, so I just cut that, and I think it improved the deck. And then lastly, there was an issue with the Invincible not having a target for its death route. Luckily, there was a broken card in the game in a different deck, which had a very nice application in this one, which is the Sinstone Graveyard. And now this card wasn't used in the same way in this deck as it is in the other ones. This one was basically to give you a stealth undead whenever you needed it. So whenever you do your big Invincible play with like your Snowfall Graveyard on the board, they don't have the option to kill off your other undead first, then the Invincible, because it's got stealth. And that was basically just a huge boost to the deck, just always giving a target for that, on top of the card just being good in general. As for the rest of the cards in this deck, they're pretty much just cycle cards to find you your stuff, or ways to kill off your own Invincible. So things like Wicked Stab, Bone Spike, Extortion can just help you find lethals, because if you've got the Snowfall Graveyard up and an Invincible on board, every time this dies, it's going to +10/+10 one of your other minions. So sometimes you can have +20 burst damage if you have a Reborn Invincible still on the board. And yeah, that was this deck. So not a from the ground up build. I just took basically someone else's idea and just added some optimizations to it, which were the Colossal Minions. The Colossal Minions and removing the Forsaken Lieutenant and putting in the location. So I guess not a completely original idea, but still very, very cool deck. Okay, that was the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for more. I might do an Evolve Shaman guide on how to play the deck, since that deck's kind of popular right now. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and see ya when I see ya.